Welcome to EPA's Competition Process webinar. I'm Elizabeth January, the Acting Senior Associate for Grants Competition at EPA. Before we get started, let's review a few housekeeping tips. The first tip is to maximize your browser window to make sure you can see all of the controls. This is especially important if you want to use the closed caption feature. Your audio is controlled by the device you're using to join this webinar. For example, your cell phone, smartphone, desktop computer, or tablet. If you're experiencing trouble with the sound or audio, turn up the volume of the device you're using and make sure your device is not muted. If that does not work, please make sure your broadcast is not paused by clicking the spacebar or anywhere on the screen. We are using the Microsoft Teams live event platform, which is like a live TV broadcast. You will be able to hear me and see the presentation. However, you can only engage with the EPA team by sending in questions. To do this, use the Q&A panel located on the top right side of your window. Click Ask a Question, which will direct your question to the moderators. This webinar will be conducted in English, and closed captions are available in Arabic, Chinese, English, Filipino, Spanish, and Vietnamese. On the bottom right corner of your window, click on the CC button to turn on live captions. Use the tool button, which is right next to the CC button, to select the language. A note about captions: these are live captions that are automatically generated in real time as the speakers are talking. They will not be 100% accurate. Lastly, a recording of today's webinar will be made available on the EPA Competition Process webinar webpage. So if you do experience difficulty in the middle of the webinar and are unable to hear or join the webinar, you will be able to see it later when we post it to that webpage. Okay, let's get started. Okay, the first thing I want to do is make sure you all are aware of the EPA Grants Update listserv. This is a great listserv. We do not spam you. We usually only send maybe one email a week, if that. But it's a really great listserv to be a part of because you get new guidance and information that we post on our website, new trainings and webinars like this one that become available to potential applicants and recipients. Any changes in grants management requirements, which includes EPA changes and government-wide changes, and any other pertinent general grants information. I also want to just start off at the beginning of the presentation, since many of you might be interested in the bipartisan infrastructure law funding. For more information on how EPA is implementing the bipartisan infrastructure law, please visit the website up on the screen. There you'll see EPA's bill funding allocations, fact sheets such as a general fact sheet for water, tribal nations, and the state revolving fund, and also other information about other programs like the cleanup, revitalization, and recycling programs, school buses, and pollution prevention. I also want to highlight some trainings that we have available for applicants and recipients. The first is our grants management training for applicants and recipients. This is a great training. You can take it at your convenience. It's split up into 6 modules, so you don't have to take it all at once. And it does learning checks along the way, so you know you're absorbing the material, and it's really handy. And even if you think you're really familiar with grants, I really recommend taking it just to get a refresher or find out any new requirements that maybe you weren't aware of. We also have a training that focuses on how to develop a budget. This includes 4 modules. It's similar to the other training where you're able to take it at your convenience, and it's split up, so you can take it over several days, weeks, months. This is a really great training to take if you're going to be preparing a proposal and budget for a competitive program. It gets into a lot of the complex requirements and guidance that surround budgets under federal grants. I highly recommend it. Also, I want to make sure that you're all aware that the unique entity identifier that the government uses to do business either through contracts or grants with entities has changed. It used to be the DUNS number, but now it's the UEI, the Unique Entity ID, that's generated by sam.gov when you register in sam.gov. So if you already are registered in sam.gov, then you already have a UEI, so you don't need to do anything. But if you are new and you have not yet registered with grants.gov, excuse me, I keep saying grants.gov, sam.gov, if you're already registered with sam.gov, you already have a UEI. If you're new, when you register, you will be assigned one. Okay, so we'll get into the meat of our presentation, which is the competition process. So this is an overview of the competitive process that we conduct here at EPA. We prepare the funding opportunity announcement. We then post that announcement on a program office website and grants.gov. We then receive applications from applicants like you, hopefully. And then we evaluate those applications and make selections. Then after we make selections, we issue awards. Also, you should be aware that the EPA award official will check the Federal Awardee Performance and Integrity and Information System, or FAPIS, prior to award to ensure that you're qualified. And this is a system that federal agencies report to and update the database so that we all have accurate current information about entities wishing to do business with the federal government. To find EPA competitive opportunities, you would go to grants.gov. That's where we post every single competitive opportunity. When you are looking for competitive opportunities, you'll find that the synopsis of that opportunity includes some really important info that gives you an overview of what that opportunity includes, like funding amounts, the eligible entities, submission deadlines, and more. You can also search the assistance listing on sam.gov so that you can determine what kind of programs you'd be interested in. And you can sign up for automatic notifications of these opportunities. And this is really a feature that we highlight because grants.gov does try to make it easy so you don't have to go in every day to try to search for opportunities or see if your opportunity has been changed. You can sign up to be emailed when those things happen automatically, and I'll be showing you how to do that a little later. This is what the grants.gov website looks like generally, and you're going to want to click on the Search Grants tab if you're looking for funding opportunities, new funding opportunities. Once you click on that Search Grants tab, you're going to see this somewhat complex search screen that gives you the opportunity to search by lots of different pieces of information. There's a place where you can enter keywords. So if there's a particular type of project you're looking to perform and you want to see if there's a funding opportunity out there that targets that type of project, you can search for that in the keywords. You can also filter by agency. So you can go down, if you just want to see Environmental Protection Agency opportunities, you can scroll down to you'll see in the lower left of my screen, agency, and you can select more than one agency if you want. And you can also search by eligibility and category. I do recommend that you, for EPA opportunities, you make sure all eligibilities are checked. And that's because when EPA posts our opportunities to grants.gov, we always select other for eligible entity types. And that's because the entity types that our programs have don't always match up well with grants.gov's entity types. So we just pick other to make sure we're not accidentally excluding anyone. And then you read the actual RFA to see who is eligible. So EPA competitive opportunities are also listed on EPA program websites. So if you're interested in a particular media like AIR, for example, you might want to bookmark the AIR program's website to go back and check to see if there are new opportunities. Grants.gov is still the best place to go, but it's not a bad idea to be aware that program offices will also have these opportunities listed. SAM.gov has the assistance listings, which are every funding program that we have at EPA, grant funding program, is described and has its own assistance listing on SAM.gov. So if you really don't know where to start and you want an idea of the kind of work EPA does and the kind of work we fund, then you want to check out sam.gov and go to assistance listings and just start browsing there. This is what that page looks like. And you can search by keyword. If you happen to know your assistance listing number, you can search by that as well. But this is a great place to start. And this is an example of an assistance listing. This is the surveys, studies, investigations, demonstrations, and training grants for the Safe Drinking Water Act. And as you can see on the left-hand side of my slide, that it's broken up into sections: overview, authorizations, financial information, etc. So you can read all about these programs in detail, and they're updated every year, so you know the information is current. This is just another view of what you would see if you were scrolling down and looking at the assistance listing. Okay, this is a really important section that I want to highlight. Before you apply, you need a sam.gov and a grants.gov registration. So I know this slide is overwhelming. There's a lot of information on here. This is a good time to point out that that the presentation is downloadable from our webinar webpage, so you can peruse at your leisure after the webinar. But I want to make sure to highlight these important parts during the webinar. First of all, if you want to apply for an EPA competitive opportunity, you need an active sam.gov registration. As I already mentioned, when you register on sam.gov, you will be assigned a unique entity ID. Now, I want to make an important distinction here. sam.gov allows you to do a type of account where you only get a unique entity ID without a full sam.gov registration. Now, if you don't want to apply directly for awards, if you don't want to receive funding, say, directly from EPA, but you want to be a sub-awardee, so that would be when we give a grant to Organization A, and then Organization A awards some of that funding to another organization, Organization B. If you're like Organization B and you don't want to register on sam.gov, you don't have to. You can just go in and get your UEI. However, if you want to apply for funding at EPA or any other federal agency, you will need to actually register in sam.gov. Having just the UEI is not enough. We have some links up on the page to help give you some more information, but sam.gov has a pretty comprehensive set of instructions and a checklist for registering properly in sam.gov. And a very important piece of registering in sam.gov is identifying your eBiz point of contact, and that includes both the name and the email address. And that will need to be done before you can move forward on your grants.gov registration. So if you go through this, what you think is a sam.gov registration, and you don't have to enter an eBiz point of contact or email address, that is a sign that some part of the process hasn't been completed, and you should contact their help desk or just go over the checklist again and make sure you've done everything. Something to be aware of is sam.gov now utilizes the login.gov. I'm sure you've seen some web pages advertising it, government pages advertising login.gov. It's a free, secure sign-in service, and it's supposed to make it easier to sign into all the various federal government websites. So you can use the same username and password to access any agency that partners with login.gov, and that includes sam.gov. And this streamlines processes and eliminates the need to remember multiple usernames and passwords. So if you see login.gov, that's what that's all about. Once you've completed your sam.gov registration and you've identified your eBiz point of contact, the next step is to register in grants.gov. There are lots of instructions on grants.gov on how to do this. We link to one of them, a video, but there are also pages that describe the process and what you need to go through. And once you have a grants.gov account, you can add profiles to associate with an applicant organization, and that gets explained more on the applicant registration page. And the reason why we don't go into detail on this webinar is grants.gov is a separate organization from us, and we are not always aware of whatever recent revisions or changes have been made. So we want to make sure you have the original source material to go and review in case it does get updated. Now, prior to being able to complete or submit application packages in grants.gov, your eBiz point of contact has to authorize roles. So they need to identify members of the organization that have logins for grants.gov that can do certain things for the organization or on behalf of the organization. And this is to protect your organizations from individuals who may attempt to submit grant applications without permission. One of these roles that's very important is the AOR role, the authorized organizational representative, and that is the person that can actually click the submit button. So if you are developing an application in grants.gov and you have everything done, but that submit button isn't working for you, that's probably why you're not an AOR, and it needs to be submitted by an AOR, or you need to be made an AOR so you can submit it. Grants.gov also uses login.gov, and that's a more recent change. But if you are using login.gov, that will probably speed up or at least make it a little easier to do your grants.gov registration. Okay, so now we're going to go over a few things that we just think are good to know: grants.gov subscriptions, workspace, and some additional resources. Grants.gov subscriptions. So you have a grants.gov account and it's great. You can go in and search, but you have a lot to do. It's hard to remember to go in all the time and look for new opportunities. And you don't want to miss a new opportunity, of course, especially since our open periods are usually only 45 days. So you want to know the day that opportunity becomes available. The best way to do that is to subscribe to a notification, and you get to decide what you get notified about. So you can set up searches that search under particular assistance listings, under particular agencies, perhaps just a keyword. Maybe you want to see any opportunity that comes through that uses the word water. You can be as specific or general as you like. You can determine how often you receive these emails. Maybe you want them daily, every week, every month. So you have a lot of control over it and how you receive those notifications. Strongly, strongly recommend setting this up so that you don't have to think about it, and you know when you get that email in your inbox, it's going to show you all the opportunities that might be interesting to you or your organization. So if you want to do that, the place you're going to go on grants.gov is the Manage Subscriptions flyout. And so when you click on that, it'll take you to this page, which has lots of different links you can click on, some quick ones that you can do, and then you can also do custom notifications. And if you ever want to stop them, it's very easy to stop them. So if you're applying for federal grants, competitive opportunities, you will be using grants.gov, and their method for preparing applications is called Workspace. Now, this is the only way to submit an application unless you have a system-to-system connection within your organization. If you do have a system-to-system connection, it may work differently. But if you don't, you will be going in and using Workspace, and there's a lot of great things about Workspace. One is you can reuse forms and auto-populate your data. So if there's a form that's particularly annoying to fill out, but the data doesn't change very often, well, you can just copy that form over and over and over again to as many applications as you want. And just remember to update any information that needs updating. That makes that a lot easier. Also, it's collaborative. Multiple members of your organization and people outside of your organization too, if you give them permission, can collaborate on this project or on that workspace. So if you have someone that's responsible for filling out the forms, but another group of people are working on preparing the actual project narrative, then you can do that. You just need to make sure the roles are assigned properly. Also, Workspace has the ability to detect errors, either in your forms or perhaps the format is wrong. So it will do an error check, and you can, I think, manually do an error check. There's a button to click at any time, and it'll give you a heads up if there seems to be something wrong. If you are a user that has intermittent internet issues, This is a really good option because the old grants.gov, you were filling out one giant application, which was a massive PDF document basically, and it took up a lot of bandwidth. But the workspace feature allows everything to be broken up. You can work on things offline. You can actually download the materials from the workspace to work on offline, or you can work on them as a web form within workspace. It's very flexible. You can learn more about workspace by clicking on the link on the bottom of the slide. These are just some other resources. We have a competition page on EPA's grants website. Also, these are some links to grants.gov resources, applicant resources, organization registration, the user guide. That's actually somewhat difficult to find, so that's a good link to have. It's a very good user guide, very searchable, lots of information in there. And then also there's some workspace information. And when you're actually, you say you found an opportunity and you're interested in applying for it. At EPA, each of our funding opportunity announcements has unique instructions and requirements. And for that reason, you need to read it carefully. Some information you want to pay particular attention to are the eligibility information, deadlines, what needs to go in your application, how we're going to review your application, and of course, there's more. We have a competition order, the EPA's competition policy, which is linked to up on the slide, that dictates and governs how EPA competes its grants. So that's a public document. We want applicants and recipients to know, and we want to be as transparent as possible. So I recommend reading it. It's a bit of a long document, but it has a lot of good information in it and can provide some insight on how EPA does our competitions. Now, I said you need to read the funding opportunity announcements carefully. So the next part of the presentation, I'm going to go through the sections of the funding opportunity announcements. Sometimes they can be quite lengthy. Usually they're not fewer than 25 pages, and often they're much longer than that, depending on how complex the program is. So the types of announcements that EPA issues, currently we really are only issuing requests for applications. And what that means is you're going to need to submit all the forms and certifications that are necessary for award at application time. And for a list of forms, you can go to our full application submission with initial proposal submission requirement RAIN, that's linked to up on the screen. And there are some other types of opportunities, but they're much less frequent. One is the request for proposals, where we request an abbreviated application and only a few forms. And then there's the request for initial proposals, and this is a two-phase competition, whereas you might submit just a 1 or 2 page summary of the project that you're looking to apply for, and then the second phase is where you submit your full application. So the actual contents of the announcement are based on Appendix I2 or Appendix 1, Roman numeral 1, to 2 CFR 200. And so you can peruse that to see what we base our content on. It's something all federal agencies are supposed to do, and that's supposed to make it a little easier for you as the applicant to know what to expect in funding opportunities. In section 1, that's where you're going to see all the information about the program that's competing it. It's going to describe the types of projects, what your application needs to address. And in section 2 is where you're going to find your federal award information. So how many awards they plan to make under that funding opportunity and how much funding they're expecting to award per award and total. Section 3 is where you'll see eligibility info. I mentioned earlier that when we publish our opportunities in grants.gov, we select other for the eligible entity types. So this is where you're going to look to figure out which of the entities are eligible for our opportunities. So whether states and tribes and nonprofits can apply, who's excluded, that kind of thing. This is also where you're going to find cost share or matching requirements. Some programs require applicants to provide or recipients to provide some of their own funding as part of the project. So this is an important section to read, not just because you need to know whether you need to provide cost share or match. It's also because the formula to determine cost share or match can differ from program to program. And not just in the amount or percentage. It can also depend on whether it's applied to the total project cost or the federal amount. For example, if you're going to be applying for $100,000 in federal funding and there's a 20% match required based on total funding, that means you're not providing $20,000 of match. You need to figure out what the total amount will be so that your match will be 20% of that. Now, if it's 20% of the federal amount, then that's a little easier. If you're requesting $100,000 of federal dollars, then you're going to provide $20,000 of match and your total project will be $120,000. Usually our solicitations are very clear in this section and even provide formulas to help you figure it out. Sometimes they provide a link to a calculator. But please pay very special attention to this, because if you get it wrong, it's possible you will just be deemed ineligible and they won't even review your application. And if you have any questions about whether you're calculating it correctly, you should definitely reach out to the point of contact listed in the funding opportunity. This is also the section you will see additional threshold eligibility criteria. Some obvious ones are usually you have to get your application in on time by the deadline. You have to submit your application through grants.gov. We do have rare exceptions to that, but it is a requirement. But some programs have additional requirements on top of that. They might require that the work you're doing and the project take place in a certain geographic location. They may require that you address certain program priorities that they discussed in section 1 of the opportunity. So read this very carefully. And if you ever have any questions about whether or not you're going to meet those threshold requirements, please just ask. We don't want you wasting your time preparing an application that isn't going to be eligible. So please reach out to EPA. In section 3, you'll see a link to additional provisions for applicants incorporated into the solicitation. And in an effort to make our solicitations a little easier to read, we've moved some of our more basic legalese to an external website, and we don't include them verbatim in the solicitation. So please make sure to click on this link to review all of these provisions. This is what that page will look like, the landing page, when you click on it. And at the bottom, you'll see a link to a PDF document. That's whatever our most current version of these clauses is. And we update it periodically as things change. And then we replace the most current one and archive the one that was there before. And this is what the beginning of that document looks like. It's a lot longer than this. You could see we have additional solicitation provisions for other sections, but sections 3 is right there, and you can see it. Section 4 is where you're going to find details about your application and submission info, instructions on how to submit and what's expected to be submitted. So your content and form of application. When you're preparing your application, you want to make sure to review section 1. So that you know what type of project you're supposed to be including, section 3 to make sure you're addressing any threshold criteria, and section 5 to make sure you're addressing all of the evaluation criteria. This section 4 will also, lay out what they expect you to put in the solicitation, but often it's going to refer back to sections 1 and 3 and 5. So just make sure you're familiar with those sections when you're preparing your proposal. Your submission method, as I mentioned earlier, must be through grants.gov, and that's for all initial applications. If for some reason down the road you need to submit a revised one after you're selected, you will likely do that outside of grants.gov, but your initial application must come through grants.gov. Section 4 will also list the submission dates and times, the deadline that you must submit your application by. The open period is typically 45 calendar days. That's the minimum we usually have at EPA. Some will be much longer than that. We have 60-day open periods sometimes, and we've had as many as, I think, 120 days. But most of them are 45. And that's why you want to sign up for those notifications so that you find out right away when the opportunity lands. So you have that full 45 days to prepare your application and be as competitive as possible. We want you to make sure to pay attention to any deadlines. The deadline to submit is obviously the most important one, but there often are other deadlines. There might be a deadline to submit questions, for example. Again, another reason to get in at the very beginning of the open period so you can read the solicitation all the way through and figure out what your questions are so you can reach out and get those answered quickly. This section also has additional provisions for applicants, so make sure you review that. Section 5 is where EPA discusses the application review information. A big piece of this will be ranking criteria. These are the criteria we use to evaluate all applications under that funding opportunity. We only use those criteria. There are no undisclosed criteria, so it's fully transparent. We expect you to address the ranking criteria in the applications, and some of the criteria are will be assessing your programmatic capability, your past performance under prior grants, if you have it, environmental results, which includes your plan for measuring progress towards achieving the outputs and outcomes that you're including in your proposal. The timely expenditure of grant funds, or your plan to ensure a timely expenditure of grant funds. We'll look at budget typically and leveraging in some cases. Not all programs evaluate leveraging. Leveraging is additional funding that you're not using necessarily as match or cost share, but you're have other agreements with other organizations to get funding or third-party support. Also, your technical approach is something that they absolutely will be evaluating to make sure your project is sound. And some announcements have something called other factors. They usually are separate from the ranking criteria. They're not ranked, and it's a list of factors that the selection official may use to go out of ranked order in when they get the ranked order list. Typically, the other factors will be something like geographic distribution. So if they're going to, I don't know, make 10 awards across the US, they may want to make sure that they're geographically distributed. And so if they have a bunch of highly ranked applicants in one region and slightly less highly ranked, but still highly ranked applicants in another region, they might want to make sure they're getting some from both so that one region doesn't get all the grant funding. And this will also describe the review and selection process that the program office will be conducting. They're largely the same across all programs, but it's good to read it and understand how EPA is going to be making their decisions. And also check the additional provisions for applicants. Section 6 is more of a post-award or post-selection part of the funding opportunity announcement. This is where how the award notices will be made, will be described. It's also where reporting requirements will be discussed. If there are quality assurance expectations, so if you're going to be doing any data collection, for example, there will be a requirement to have either a quality management plan or a quality assurance program plan. And while you won't necessarily need to address that in your proposal, it is something we want you to be aware of. So that if you do get selected, you know that this is going to be expected of you. This is also where you'll find the dispute resolution process and debriefings information. If you are not selected, you will have the opportunity to request a debriefing, and you have to do it within a certain time frame. So it's important to be familiar with our processes as far as debriefings and disputes go. I would highly recommend requesting a debriefing if you aren't selected. They can be really helpful to know what you did well, but then also what you can work on to be more competitive in the next funding opportunity competition. And this is where a bulk of those additional provisions are in Section 6. It's good to become familiar with them. And of course, if you have any questions about any of the clauses when you're reading a solicitation, ones that are included in text or ones that are by reference like these, make sure to reach out to your point of contact and ask. Section 7 is where you're going to find your contacts. This is a very important section. The EPA point of contacts listed in Section 7 are the best people to ask questions about that particular opportunity. And especially eligibility questions. We want you to be asking those because if you do have a question about your eligibility, we want to be able to answer it early on in the process so you know whether to continue with your proposal preparation. Section 8 is reserved for other information. It's an optional section. Sometimes you'll see background links, links to background information included there, or maybe additional information about developing a quality assurance plan, that kind of thing. Often the opportunities will not even have a Section 8, so don't be alarmed if it's missing. Now, since these are open for 45 days, and because we do try to be responsive, if there's a bunch of questions about a section in the funding opportunity announcement and it's just clear that it's super confusing and we need to update it, we will do that because we don't want things to be hard. So if we do modify an announcement, and that includes clarification of requirements, or sometimes we extend the funding opportunity announcement, we do post that on grants.gov. And a really nifty feature of grants.gov is when you find an opportunity and you're interested in applying for it, there's a way to sign up to receive automatic notification of any modifications to that announcement. So you won't have to go back and check it multiple times. You will get an email if we change it. And we always describe what those changes are when we provide that notification. So if it ends up being a minor thing, you don't end up having to reread the whole announcement. And even if it isn't minor, we will identify where in the announcement we have made those changes to make it easier for you to identify them. So I mentioned earlier to reach out to our point of contact if you have any questions. Now, to keep the integrity of our competitions, we do have rules about how we communicate with potential applicants. We discuss this at great length in Section 11 of our policy, but I'll go over some highlights in this presentation. We provide limitations on what can be discussed and at what point. We have pretty strict guardrails on any pre-proposal assistance. Programs will often post questions and answers. So as they receive questions during their open period, or maybe from prior competitions where they received questions, they will document those questions and the answers and make sure they're available to anybody who's interested. Some program offices, many actually, will offer conference calls or webinars during the open period where applicants can ask questions. And that's a great way to go and not only ask your own questions, but hear what other people's questions are. So you can maybe learn more than you thought you could. The information about that kind of pre-proposal assistance is usually in Section 4 or Section 7 of the funding opportunity. So just be on the lookout for that as you're reading the announcement. Now, if you do reach out to us, these are the types of things we can help you with. As I mentioned prior, we can help you with applicant eligibility questions. So if you're ever unsure if you or your project is eligible, just ask. If you have any questions about administrative aspects of the proposal submission, like if there's like, oh, you have to have a map attached as attachment 10 or something, and you're like, wait, but there aren't 9 other attachments, I don't understand. You can reach out and ask. And sometimes we made a typo and we're really grateful you asked, so we can go fix it in the solicitation. But sometimes it's just, you know, a little confusing, and we can help unravel it so that you know exactly what's expected of you. And just in general, other clarifications, if there's something confusing in the instructions on what you're supposed to submit or what type of project it is or what eligible activities there are, just ask. If we can clarify it, we will. And if we can't, then we'll tell you, but it doesn't hurt to ask. If we do need to clarify to the point where we need to actually modify the announcement, that will be communicated to everybody. So you don't have to worry about missing out on any changes or, clarifications that just because you didn't ask the question, the question and answer or FAQ that the program provides or revisions to the existing announcement will make sure that you have that information. Now, the things we cannot do. We can't write your applications for you. We can't really review or comment on your applications. If you send us your proposal and say, hey, do you think this will be competitive? We cannot answer that. We will not answer that. And that would be unfair to the other applicants if we did. Now, we also can't provide any additional information that's not in the solicitation about anything, actually, but particularly how we're going to be evaluating those applications. If we were to give additional information that's not in the funding opportunity, it would be extremely unfair to all the other applicants that don't have that information. And so if we do something like that, if we clarify something like I mentioned earlier, and it provides additional information, we're going to update that solicitation to make sure everybody has that information. And just in general, we can't provide a competitive advantage to any applicant. It's very important at EPA that we have integrity in our competitions and that everyone knows they're being treated equitably and fairly. And so part of that is to make sure we're not giving any help to any one applicant over another. So we try to be really, really careful about that. Now, once we do go through the evaluation process and all the questions have been asked, and the open period is ended and we received all the applications. So any applications that get through the eligibility threshold review will be evaluated by the criteria in Section 5. And then the selections are based on the ranking of those applications, those scored applications, in combination with those other factors that I mentioned earlier. Now, if you are determined to be ineligible, if your application is ineligible, or you haven't been selected, you'll be notified within 15 days of that determination being made, and then you will have 15 days to request a debriefing, calendar days. So it, shouldn't be drawn out. It's not like you won't find out for months and months after everyone else gets their award. That's not how it works. You will be notified if you were not selected in a timely fashion, and then you have the ability to request a debriefing. And again, I strongly encourage you to request debriefings. Now, if you are selected, you also will be notified, and you'll also get information on what the next steps are. And sometimes that can include submitting additional information. For example, if you need to complete a quality assurance plan, you'll get information about that. There might be some things you need to clarify in your application, or you might need to resubmit a form, but the program office will reach out to you and let you know what you need to do. Something that I want to make sure to mention is that selection notification is not approval to begin work. That's very important. You have to undergo additional review after you're selected. And that review is just to make sure your proposal is in compliance with programmatic and administrative grant requirements. And so you'll know when you can begin work when you receive a notice of award signed by an EPA award official. And it's an official document, and it'll be very clear it's an award. And if you have any question about whether what you've received is an indication that you can start work, please just ask. Because if you start work before your award, there is a very real possibility you will not get reimbursed for the funds that you spend to do that work. So this is a really important piece of information. Now, I know I ran through a lot of information there, and I can see that there's lots of questions coming in that I haven't had a chance to read yet. But if we aren't able to answer your question today, or you don't think of it right now and think of it later, I want you to make sure you have this contact information so you can reach out directly. My contact information is right at the top, and the other 3 people listed up on the slide, Val Swan Townsend, Alexandra Raver, and Miranda Larson, they are all on my team and are very knowledgeable people, and they can answer your questions about how EPA implements and oversees competitions, grant competitions. Okay, and I took a little longer than I was expecting. I'm sorry, I wanted to leave more time for questions. So I want to see what kind of questions we have, and I might highlight some by reading them out loud, just to make sure everyone's getting the benefit. Just to emphasize again, the slides are available for download currently at our webinar webpage, so you should feel free to go and download that, and all those links should work for you, so you can click on them. So I'm not sure they work during this event, so please be sure to download it. How can we be evaluated for grants if we're a new applicant without prior business or grant history? So the way that we deal with that, because we recognize, that is problematic. We don't want to discourage new applicants. In fact, we want to encourage new applicants. So we don't want to penalize you if you don't have prior experience. So in the solicitations where we evaluate past performance, which is in most of them, if you do not have past performance, you need to state that clearly. And the reason I tell you that is because if you do not address it at all, then it is likely you will get a 0 for that particular criterion. But if you state we do not have past performance or relevant past performance, then you get a neutral score. And so that's usually half the points that they would award you. So if it's worth 10 points, you would get 5. And that's the best way we've been able to come up with to make sure that we're not unduly punishing new applicants. I do want to point out that there are some programs that are starting to create carve-outs or set-asides for new applicants. So if they're competing $1 million, they'll carve out 200,000 just for new applicants. And so those applicants will go on their own ranking list. They'll be evaluated and put in their own list. They won't be, their ranking won't be competing against experienced applicants that do have past performance, and that can help make it easier to be competitive if you're a new applicant. So expect to see, look for that. That would be usually listed in section 2 or section 5 of the funding opportunity announcement, where they would discuss whether they were going to be creating a set aside for a particular applicant type or entity type, and new applicants is definitely one of those areas that we do that with. Let's see. Looks like I just want to make sure I pick any. Okay, so there's a lot of questions about SAM.gov and grants.gov, which looks like my team's doing a great job of answering, but I want to make sure that everyone is aware that there are help desks available for those 2 different sites, SAM.gov and grants.gov. And it's really important to reach out to these help desks if you encounter any difficulty, and in particular, for competitive opportunities, we have a provision in the opportunity that if you are experiencing technical difficulties with submitting through grants.gov, in order for us to help you or potentially entertain you submitting your application outside of grants.gov, there are certain things you need to do. And one of them is contact the grants.gov help desk and record the ticket number or numbers associated with your contacts. So we want to see that you're trying to resolve the problem. And also, we're typically looking for evidence that you tried to register in sam.gov and or grants.gov early on in the process, so we know you're giving yourself enough time. In our funding opportunity announcements, we indicate that it can take up to a month to complete that whole process. So with a 45-day open period, that's not giving you much wiggle room. So on that note, I highly recommend that you apply or you register in sam.gov and then grants.gov, even if you don't have an opportunity that you want to apply for right now. In fact, even whether or not you have an opportunity, if you even think there's a possibility that you'll want to apply for grant funding in the future, register. Because unforeseen things can happen. There can be hiccups. Someone can leave your organization, leading to needing to update information mid-process. So just start as soon as possible, get through that hurdle. So then all you have to worry about is creating a competitive proposal, which is enough to worry about. You don't have to worry about registering too. So make sure you try to do that early on in the process. See. Okay, we have a question about EJ. With the direction to help more EJ and needy communities, how will EPA ensure those communities are prioritized if their application is not reviewed due to a technical error? Some of these communities are the ones most likely to not have a professional proposal writer, lack staff to even spend time on this, are not technically savvy, and or may not even have the ability or knowledge to process an application online. So that's a great question, and that is something that EPA is continually working towards, is making our application process as accessible as possible. Some program offices are trying to make sure they're providing, simple instructions on what needs to go in the proposal. And I'm not exactly sure what you mean by technical issues. But if you're talking about registering in sam.gov and grants.gov and the potential issues that can crop up because of that, I would just encourage you to document the issues you're having, contact the help desk, and follow the directions in section 4 of the funding opportunity announcement. One of the things that in those instructions dictate for you to do is to email your complete application to a particular email address before the deadline. And what that allows us to do is to evaluate the particular circumstances of your situation and what difficulties that you had with either sam.gov or grants.gov or both, and decide whether or not it makes sense to allow you to submit outside of grants.gov. If we do make that decision, the next thing we have to look at is, do we have an application that was submitted on time? So if you haven't emailed it to us, we can't let you in because we didn't have an on-time application. So those instructions are very clear in section 4, and some applicants seem to overlook that part. So I just want to draw attention that you do need to submit that complete full application via email prior to the deadline if you're looking to be let into the competition outside of grants.gov. Now, something I just want to point out is that we struggle, we really try to make sure that our treatment of all applicants is fair and equitable. And if we have we have a lot of applications where the applicants were able to register properly and submit their applications through grants.gov, and they spent some of their valuable time doing that and they get their application in, then we have to take that into consideration when we're thinking about whether to let the applicants in that we're not able to manage those hurdles. But again, we do look at every case individually and evaluate that particular applicant's issues that they experienced. And if there's even a hint that it might have been the government system causing the issue, then we will want to let you in. But we need to have that application submitted by the deadline in order to do that. So please just make sure you do all of those things so we can do our best to help you be considered. There was a question about changes EPA is requiring for procurement. While the question was answered that this presentation is about grants, and our office handles assistance agreements, and a different office handles the contracts. There are procurement requirements under grants. So if you have a grant and you want to use some of the funds you get under that grant to contract work out, we do have in 2 CFR 200 the procurement requirements and regulations that you have to follow in order for the procurement to be in compliance with those regulations. Those have not changed recently, but we are starting to put some kind of guidelines in some of our solicitations about procurement that are a bit more specific than we have in the past. They're not actually changes, they're just drawing attention to requirements that already were in existence. And those guidelines are regarding if a applicant has a contractor in their proposal and they name that contractor, but it turns out once they're selected and we're trying to make the award that they didn't follow proper procurement procedures when they selected that contractor, that can actually jeopardize that award from being made because it was not in compliance with the regulations. So we've been trying to be more clear about that in our funding opportunity announcements to make sure applicants are aware that they should not be writing contractors into their proposals, and that includes consultants. So if you have consultants helping you write your grant application, I will warn you that that can be a problem if they write themselves into the grant application so that they are going to receive funding under that grant. And we have had situations where that has made an applicant ineligible to receive a grant or to be considered for that grant because of the way the consultant wrote the application. So just be wary of that if you are using grant writers or consultants to help you prepare your proposals, that we do have strict regulations. Well, all agencies have to follow it, not just EPA, that govern those procurements and how you select them. I'm just looking through other questions. Looks like most of them got answered already. Oh, we have a great question about how to learn more about the uniform guidance for applicants. That's 2 CFR 200 for applicants who've never received a federal grant before and want to make sure they're following all the requirements. That's a really great question. They are complex and long. Well, this is probably a good time to put a plug in for our next webinar in the series that goes over how to prepare a budget, which includes lots of references to the regulations that govern preparing budgets and conducting business under your grant, and the rules around federal dollars and match dollars that you need to be aware of. Also, those trainings that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, while they don't go through the uniform grant guidance line by line, we do try to talk about what things you need to be aware of when you're managing your grant, which includes the regulations and requirements that come from those regulations. So if you haven't taken those trainings, I highly recommend them. That'll get you off on a good start on what kinds of things in the uniform grants guidance that you need to be aware of. But I would just, recommend some, if you have trouble going to sleep at night, that's a good time to try to read the Code of Federal Regulations, but just become familiar with it. And that way, when you get a grant, you know generally what you need to be aware of, and then you can ask questions of your grant specialist or your project officer if you're not sure about with whether what you're doing is in line with and compliant with the grant regulations. See. Well, we only have 2 minutes left, and which isn't a lot of time. but it looks like most of the questions were answered. So I'm actually going to do a quick speed run of the ECFR, since we did get a question of the uniform grant about the uniform grants guidance. So I'd like to just show you really quickly, if you're not familiar with it, this is the electronic CFR. This is where our regulations are. The regulations, well, there's a lot more than just grant regulations in here, but the ones that you would be concerned about under this webinar would be our grants regulations. And they are located in Title 2, 2 CFR 200, 2 refers to the title. So if you click on Title 2, you'll see another table of contents, and the part of Title 2 that we're interested in is 200. So you find 200. So subtitle A covers 1 through 299, and then Chapter 2 of Part 1 of Subtitle A is the Office of Management and Budget Guidance. So you click on that, and then that's going to give you bring you to yet another table of contents. Now, this is the table of contents for all of 2 CFR 200, but it's just a table of contents, and I find that frustrating. So instead of having to click on each subsection, what I recommend, oh, wait, that did not work the way I wanted it to. So this is why we need to do this. Let's see, hold on, I'm just gonna hit back. Sorry, guys. So once you click Chapter 2, this is what I wanted. So you see the table of contents, but then Part 200 is what you're interested in. Click on that again, and that's gonna explode it, so that you can see, I don't know if you can see, but my scroll bar over here is really tiny. That's because this whole Part 200 is in here, all of the text. And this is a lot to read, but this is the best way to search it. So once you get to this page and it has all the information in there, you don't have to read it. Well, I mean, you should read it, but if you're looking for a particular thing, you can search for something like indirect cost, and you will see that there are lots and lots of references, and they're all highlighted here, and you can just search through them and say, okay, where's the information I'm looking for indirect cost? And you can kind of get familiar with where these things are located. Another one to be aware of now that we have, less than negative minute left. If you go back, actually go back to the main ECFR, and go back to 200, and then you want to go to Subtitle B. And this is where EPA's specific regulations are, and all the agencies have them. So you click on that, and it's 2 CFR 1500, and we're back at the table of contents again, and you click on it, and then it'll explode it. Now, this is not nearly as long as 2 CFR 200, but this is good to be familiar with if you're going to apply to EPA grants. This is where our regulations differ or expand upon the other regulations. So I just want to make sure you're aware of where these are. Does not help you understand them. I understand that, but this is a good start, and it can be a good place to start poking around. I recommend starting with 2 CFR 1500 because it's much more digestible. And you'll see here we have, something on pre-award costs, there's general procurement standards. I talked about those a little bit. So again, these are in addition to 2 CFR Part 200, but they're just as important. And now that we are officially 2 minutes over, so I'm going to stop babbling. Hopefully we're able to get to all your questions. We will be publishing an FAQ or a Q&A on our webinar page. So any questions that were asked today will go on there. So if there were some that went unanswered, we'll be attempting to answer them in that document. So just be looking for that in the next couple weeks. And that can be a really great resource just to be aware of if you, are saying, oh, I don't know about this. Let me see if someone's asked this question in a webinar. And you can, because it includes questions from our prior webinars as well. I appreciate all of you attending this webinar and participating in it. Please send in additional questions. If you think of them, you can contact me directly. I'll put back up my contact information. And, we'll be having 2 more webinars as a part of this series. The next one's on the budget detail. Highly recommend signing up for it if you haven't already. And don't worry, I won't be presenting, so you won't have to listen to me for another hour. Thanks, everyone.